I'll keep an eye on the waiting room.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the legislative update, which is our final session in 2030 vision from climate action to climate justice. My name is Renee Igo. I'm the communications and project coordinator at the Center for an Ecology-Based Economy. And Scott Blon, our executive director, is also helping host this evening. If you're new to CB, we're the Center for an Ecology-Based Economy in Norway. We're a small but mighty force for climate justice over here in the Western foothills. And our work is a balance of organizing and direct action with practical ecological solutions. So that's why you'll hear us talk about everything from seed swaps and bike lanes to engaging with our legislators. And if you read Maine's climate action plan, you'll see that a lot of what's in there is stuff that CB's been doing for the past 8 years. So we're glad that the state government is catching up with us here, and we're continuing in this work together. We're looking forward to continue to help municipalities like Norway develop and implement their own climate action plans during this process. Tonight, we've got two experts in the room to catch us up on the goings-on in Augusta during this legislative session. And there'll be questions for each of them, and then we'll have a bit more of a general discussion afterwards. So thanks for joining us. Scott has a brief poll. We're just curious about how you all heard about this event. So Scott, do you want to give us a quick poll?
Gonna try. Here we go. How did you find us? Wow.
Did you want us to answer speaking?
If you can see the poll, just go ahead and put it in the poll there.
Oh.
We'll have a complete record. Nobody heard our radio ad. It was exciting though. First time we've ever done that.
We heard it, that's what counts.
We heard it. All right, I think everybody's voted. So look at that. Aretha wins, heard it through the grapevine, 7 people. Our newsletter, other organizations, and social media, great. All right.
Cool. Let's move on. Can I get the next slide, Mike? Yes, we want to start off by thanking our sponsors, especially our movement builder sponsor, Wheelers Insurance. We see a bunch of great organizations and businesses here who support us, and we can return the favor and support them. Can I get the next slide? I also want to take a moment to acknowledge for those of us who are non-native people that we are on stolen land. My living room, CB's office in Norway, and wherever you are is all stolen land that rightfully belongs to the Wabanaki. Indigenous people and tribes are still here in Maine, and as non-native people, we still owe them a debt. I invite you to take time to learn about and support the Wabanaki in their work for tribal sovereignty as one step towards righting our wrongs. If you're new to Zoom, please keep yourself muted during the presentation. We are recording it, so if you don't want your video to be part of the recording, you can turn your camera off. But if you're okay with your camera being on, we love to see and engage and make it feel like we're actually a group of people in a room together, not just me talking to myself. In your upper right-hand corner, you'll see some different view options that you can play around with to see what works best for your device. If you have any tech challenges, Mike Dunn has the words tech support in his name, and you can privately chat him and he'll try to support you. Before I introduce our first speaker, I just want to frame a little bit of why it's so important that we're all here tonight. And if you know me at all, you know that I'm a person who's not passionate about policy and legislation. I tend to be a bit more hands-on, whether that's building trails or leading month-long wilderness expeditions for youth or working on my sheep farm. I'm a pretty action-oriented person. So it's been a really different year for me this past year as I've started dipping my toes in the water of climate policy and legislation in Maine. And it's my opinion that we can't rely on career politicians and career lobbyists and bureaucrats to fix this mess. To paraphrase somebody else, we can't use the ways of thinking that got us here to get us out of the climate crisis. We need new ways of thinking, which means we need new people involved. So we are needed, all of our voices are needed on behalf of those who can't speak up, whether that's because they're in elementary school, or because they're working 3 jobs, or because they're non-human beings. So thank you for making the time to be here tonight with us. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, which is Dr. Cassaundra Rose of the Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation, and the Future, or GOPIF for short. Dr. Rose is a senior science analyst and climate council coordinator at GOPIF. She has more than 10 years of academic climate research and policy experience and joined GOPIF in 2019 to coordinate the Climate Council. She holds an MS in geology from the University of California, Riverside, and a PhD in Earth and Environmental Science from Columbia University. During her talk, you can feel free to put questions in the chat that we'll field afterwards. So welcome, Dr. Rose.
Thank you, Renee. Okay, I will share my slides and get started. Thank you to everybody at CB and to you all for joining us this evening and for inviting me to be here. I'm Cassaundra Rose. As Renee mentioned, I come to this work not as a lobbyist or a politician, but as a climate scientist by training who got involved with policy and communications post-PhD because I cared a lot about taking action about climate change. And I'm really thrilled to be here representing the GOPIF office and the Maine Climate Council. And I have a lot of slides to go through today. I'm going to do my best to get through them, and I'm happy to answer your questions about the process or the beginning of the legislative session and implementation of Maine's brand new climate action plan. So when Governor Mills came to office in early 2019, just over 2 years ago, she made tackling climate change a priority for her administration and has taken bold action in the first 2 years to support renewable energy and energy efficiency, electric vehicles, reducing hydrofluorocarbons, which are a type of super greenhouse gas, and much more. Maine also joined the U.S. Climate Alliance at her direction, which is a bipartisan coalition of 25 U.S. states committed to meeting the Paris Climate Agreement goals in her first year in office. And we're happy that the federal government has followed Maine's lead this year in rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement. So Governor Mills directed my office, the Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation, and the Future, with helping to lead, coordinate, and support the efforts of the state to tackle this major issue. I wanted to start with a very quick walkthrough of how Maine is tackling climate change head-on and what role the Maine Climate Council has played in crafting Maine's new climate action plan. And it's going to be a lot of information, and I'll show you at the end where you can learn more at a more leisurely pace on our YouTube channel. So the governor proposed the legislation that created the Maine Climate Council and established ambitious greenhouse gas reductions targets in the last legislative session. And this legislation, LD 1679, passed with very broad bipartisan support and was signed into law in 2019. And we're really proud that it passed out of the Environment and Natural Resources Committee in the legislature unanimously before it went to the full floor. So that law, LD 1679, set ambitious climate change action goals and created the Climate Council to develop strategies to achieve those goals. This is a little different than from how other states have have mandated climate action by executive order or by state agency rulemaking. So the goals are to reduce our gross greenhouse gas emissions, or just what's going into the atmosphere, by 45% below 1990 levels by 2030 and at least 80% by 2050. Maine's Department of Environmental Protection reports these emissions every 2 years, also by law. Another law passed in the Maine legislature last year also requires that Maine's energy hit certain renewable energy generation goals over that time as well. Governor Mills also signed an executive order requiring that our state achieve carbon neutrality by 2045, meaning that as much carbon as we emit into the atmosphere each year needs to also be sequestered or buried in our natural working lands and waters. LD 1679 also requires that the climate plan work towards supporting resilience in Maine's people, communities, and industries and environments, and that our climate response is equitable and fosters economic opportunity and prosperity. So just a few small goals, all in one law. And lastly, the law required that climate plans be delivered and updated every 4 years, beginning December 1st, 2020. And that law created the Maine Climate Council to come up with that climate action plan that lays out ambitious goals to reduce our emissions and be more resilient. So the 39-member Climate Council and 6 working groups and a scientific and technical subcommittee includes more than 230 Maine people with a diverse set of experiences, backgrounds, and lived experiences who worked over 15 months to develop the state climate action plan. So the scientific and technical subcommittee was responsible for identifying the impacts of climate change in Maine, and I'll go through a few of those in my slides. And the 6 working groups listed on this slide researched and recommended strategies to the council for achieving our climate goals in areas like transportation, buildings, energy, coastal marine areas, natural and working lands, community resilience, public health, and emergency management. Maine has one of the largest climate councils in the nation. In case anybody was wondering, this was quite a large group of people to bring together and work together, particularly as the pandemic began last spring. As part of the new climate plan, a new equity subcommittee has also been created that will support planning and implementation of climate strategies to ensure benefits across diverse populations of Maine people. So in addition to recommendations coming from our working groups and reports that they created, the work of the Climate Council was informed by several scientific and technical analyses, including an overview of the impacts of climate change, as I mentioned before, the scientific assessment of climate change by some of the leading climate change experts in the state, economic analysis and greenhouse gas modeling of the draft strategies from the working group. So how much greenhouse gas bang do you get for your buck? Vulnerability maps to some of the major impacts of climate change, as well as a cost of doing nothing or cost to the state from climate change with our current policies, an equity analysis of those strategies, and a transition plan to identify pathways and strategies for the advancement of Maine's growing clean energy economy. As I mentioned before, the STS, Scientific and Technical Subcommittee, was charged with providing a summary of the impacts of climate change in Maine, and I worked particularly closely with that group to help them come up with that report. They also came up with specific projections called for by the law, like estimates of relative sea level rise over the next century. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about those as we go through. So the STS and working groups, which were launched in September 2019, met monthly for about 8 months to characterize the impacts of climate change and suggest those strategies. And they all produce reports to inform the Maine Climate Council. So once the council received those recommendations, they considered all of these strategies in the context of the scientific and technical reports I showed on the last slide. And they brought those together in the final climate action plan, December 1st of last year. Moving forward, the Climate Council and working groups will be meeting at least quarterly to monitor the implementation of the climate plan. The actual plan itself is a purely advisory plan. The Climate Council is made up of volunteers who do not have regulatory authority, but the state agencies and legislature are taking the recommendations of the plan and putting that plan into action. The thing that I really like about the law that created this whole process is that it recognizes that climate's going to change over time, and we're going to have to adjust what we're doing. And so it requires that every 4 years, the Climate Action Plan be updated by the working groups in the Maine Climate Council. So we have our work cut out. I'm already thinking about the next report in 2024, but we're really excited to be at this implementation step of the whole process. So as I mentioned, the final climate plan, Maine Won't Wait, was presented to the governor and the legislature last December. So the climate plan includes 8 primary strategies that tackle both lowering our greenhouse gas emissions and resilience to the impacts of climate change. The first 3 strategies on the left address the biggest source of emissions, Maine's transportation, buildings, and energy sectors. I'm going to quickly start by reviewing these first 2 strategies and talk about why it's important to reduce emissions and what impact those emissions are having on globally and on Maine. So in Maine, 3/4 of our greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation and building heating alone, which is a little bit unusual for US states. That's followed by commercial and industrial sectors and electric power generation. In a moment, you'll see that a number of the proposed strategies in Maine Won't Wait aim to reduce our reliance on the combustion of fossil fuels through efficiency and weatherization and by electrifying transportation and building heating and cooling. So as a climate scientist, I always like to inject like a tiny bit of climate science to educate people I'm talking to. So I'm going to go through a little bit through some of the impacts of climate change now. And all of the facts I'm talking about today are listed in that scientific and technical subcommittee report that I mentioned before. So anybody who really wants to dig in, that is a fantastic and exhaustive report that I will point you to for more details. So this is a graph some of you may have seen before, you may not. It just shows CO2 levels in the atmosphere as measured over the last 800,000 years of Earth history. So this is a record that's compiled from direct measurements over the last 50 years or so, 60 years, and then ice core records. So it shows that over time, our CO2 levels have gone between around 280 parts per million and 180 parts per million. And what you can see if you look at what's happening today is that greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere are much, much higher, about 50% higher than at any warm period in the last 800,000 years. Temperatures mirror CO2 globally over time, so that when CO2 is high, global temperatures are warmer and vice versa. Each of the peaks in this graph show you a warm period, and each of the valleys show you an ice age. This was our last ice age here in Maine when we had a mile of ice over us. As far as climate scientists can tell, this really rapid rise in greenhouse gas emissions may be the fastest that this amount of greenhouse gases have been released to Earth's atmosphere in all 4.5 billion years of Earth's history. It is happening remarkably quickly, which is very concerning. Climate scientists estimate that greenhouse gases in our atmosphere are at their highest level in 3.3 million years. We know from study of past climate records that temperatures about 3 million years ago were 3.5 to 5.5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer, and sea levels were about 60 feet higher than today. So the stakes are high when it comes to raising greenhouse gases this high and this quickly in the Earth's climate system, and why we have to really work on strategies to reduce them globally and here in Maine. So ultimately, reducing our greenhouse gases means helping to prevent Earth's thermostat from rising to dangerously high levels for humans in the environment. While temperatures globally have risen about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, Maine's land temperatures have increased over 3 degrees Fahrenheit since 1895, with coastal areas warming more than the interior of the state. And moving into the future, depending on how successful we are at reducing our emissions, temperatures may increase by an additional 2 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit by 2050 and up to 10 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100. When my office asked members of the public last summer about what they've noticed from climate change, the vast majority of people told us they've noticed over their lifetimes that Maine is warming up, from gardeners and farmers who've been growing for over 50 years to fishermen to young people as well. The Gulf of Maine also, our ocean water and coastal waters have exhibited significant warming, which will result in shifts in our fisheries over time, getting more warmer water fisheries and losing some of our subarctic fisheries that we're used to seeing in the Gulf of Maine, with attending impacts on our fisheries and aquaculture industries. So the first few strategies of the climate plan are trying to tackle this really important issue of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The first strategy, Embrace the Future of Transportation in Maine, focuses on accelerating Maine's transition to electric vehicles with a goal of putting 41,000 light-duty EVs on the road by 2025 and over 200,000 by 2030. This is a really big, ambitious goal, but our greenhouse gas modeling showed that this is one of the most effective strategies to reduce Maine's emissions very rapidly. In addition, reducing vehicle miles traveled with increased access to high-speed internet, which is very important for other reasons as well, improved land use and remote work policies, and improving public transportation and walkability, bikeability. These are all critically important to embracing the future of transportation to reduce our emissions. And I put a little update on here. Efficiency Maine Trust just in the last couple of months has bumped up their electric vehicle rebates, particularly for low-income Mainers, state and local government entities, and tribal governments. So if you hadn't heard about that, that's a fantastic opportunity to make EVs more accessible to all Mainers, but particularly low income. Strategy B focuses on modernizing our buildings by making them more energy efficient, smarter, and cost effective. So tackling our heating, cooling, and lighting, transitioning to cleaner heating and cooling systems, more efficient appliances, and trying to reach a goal of 145,000 heat pumps installed in Maine by 2025. The pace of installation is actually pretty good so far, and there are, again, great incentives from Efficiency Maine Trust for both heating and weatherization insulation of homes. And there are a number of bills in the current legislative session that also tackle some of these goals here, like replacing hydrofluorocarbons with climate-friendly alternatives in our refrigeration and foams, as well as addressing appliance efficiency standards. So strategy C seeks to reduce carbon emissions in our energy generation. It really matters where our energy is coming from. Maine already has a fair amount of renewable energy generation, and we have this strategy makes many recommendations to ensure that we have an adequate, affordable, clean energy supply to power the increased load on our grid with electrification, and ensuring that we reach our renewable energy generation goals as well. So strategies D through H in the climate plan all center around improving resilience in Maine communities, people, and environments to climate change, supporting healthy environments and working lands and waters, improving carbon sequestration in our natural and working lands and waters, and supporting climate education and communications in the state. So I think I'm not sure how I'm doing on time. I'll try to move quickly, but I'll move quickly through some of the impacts on that require us to become a little more resilient to the impacts of climate change. So warming is causing increased precipitation, with statewide annual precipitation increasing over 6 inches since 1895. I probably don't have to tell any of you, we've had a lot of really big rainstorms and even snowstorms, particularly in the last decade. And with greater warming can also become more unpredictable rainfalls and snowfall, short-term droughts, and more frequent severe storms striking without much warning. So that's a big problem for a lot of people and communities, but also a lot of sectors like farming and aquaculture that rely on more predictable precipitation in particular. So is Maine's climate environment is affected by climate shifts like warming temperatures and unpredictable precipitation. Up to 2/3 of our plants and animal species, habitats, and at-risk species are highly or moderately vulnerable to climate change as well. Two additional effects of warming oceans are melting sea ice and rising sea levels, of which the latter in Maine is accelerating. And the Maine Climate Council has made some specific recommendations to plan for between about 1.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050 and 3.9 feet of sea level rise by 2100. And climate change will affect all sectors of our economy, from tourism, agriculture, and forestry to transportation and trade. The incidence of flooding and damage to property and infrastructure is something to plan for. However, there are some opportunities that we hope Mainers will be able to take advantage of to grow Maine's economy while also becoming more resilient to climate change, as I'll talk about over the next few slides. So I'll just very quickly move through these strategies. The climate plan seeks to grow our clean energy economy and also protect our natural resource industries and make them more resilient to climate change and help them take advantage of opportunities to grow while also reducing our impact on climate. Governor Mell set a goal of doubling our clean energy jobs by 2030 as part of the rollout of the climate plan, so it's a very important aspect of that strategy. Strategy E is probably the strategy I worked on the most as part of my office. It seeks to protect our natural and working lands and waters from climate change and development, which can harm their ability to help Maine achieve our biodiversity and carbon neutrality and sequestration goals. And so there's a 30 by 30 initiative in there to conserve at least 30% of Maine's lands and waters by 2030. Apologies. And particularly to help our forests maintain the very large carbon sink that they are today, about 75%, equivalent of 75% of our annual emissions. Strategy F helps to seeks to broadly provide state support to communities to be proactive about acting on climate change to reduce their risk, and underlines the use of sound scientific data to inform policy making and rulemaking. One prominent recommendation here is the incorporation of sea level rise projections into regulations in the next couple of years. And this is a bill that's going to be coming out any day now in the legislature, and will be considered by the Environment and Natural Resources Committee. So we're really excited to see that. The last strategy, invest in climate ready infrastructure, I think pretty straightforward. And strategy H, the very last strategy, seeks to support climate change communications and education throughout the state. So Scott asked me for a few examples of how individuals might be able and communities might be able to tackle climate change. And we have several examples from the Maine Climate Action Plan that I wanted to show here, like Travis Ritchie, who is a person who's extremely passionate about electric vehicles, has bought one himself, and also co-founded the Maine Electric Vehicle Association to help inspire people to switch to electric vehicles. We also have a number of examples of innovation, communities taking action and individuals taking action. For example, Maine's new startup Go Labs, which will be making climate-friendly wood fiber insulation from wood industry byproducts beginning this year. Kamoskata, which is pretty close to where I am on the mid-coast area, which is taking action to protect their downtown from sea level rise, and heat pump adoption around the state. You wouldn't guess it, but or necessarily think this, but up in the county has the highest rate of adoption of heat pumps in the last few years, according to Efficiency Maine. So long-term next steps, my office is working to report metrics to the Maine Climate Council and the legislature on the implementation of the Climate Action Plan. It's really important to be able to track our progress on this. DEP will continue to report emissions every 2 years, and they're going to begin reporting on carbon sequestration in addition to gross emissions. in their next report. Maine Climate Council will continue to meet quarterly, and all of their meetings are open to the public and recorded. Working groups and subcommittees will continue to meet as well, at least twice a year, to monitor progress on the plan. And we have a lot of ongoing processes, so working with stakeholders, action in the legislature, and rulemaking. I think I mentioned a few of these before. And one thing I'll highlight is that Governor Mills will be releasing some bond proposals pretty soon. And she touched on what she'll be including and highlighting in her bond proposals in her State of the Budget speech in late February. So with that, thank you. I think I went a little bit long, but I appreciate your attention and I'm happy to answer questions.
Oh, that was great. No worries about the time. Thank you so much. A couple of things I just wanted to note there is one that Travis Ritchie is on our advisory board and was a big presenter at our EV Expo this year. He's become a EV rock star around here. And also I love that you mentioned that the US government has followed Maine, and if Maine followed CB, then we can take a lot of credit there. Anyway, so we have some questions. The first one, and this is the one I've heard come up before, is could all of these goals be reversed by a future administration? There's two parts to the question. Would that also be true if the Pine Tree Amendment was passed? I'm sure you're aware the Pine Tree Amendment got through committee yesterday glowingly. So there's a two-part question for you.
Great. Well, that is a great question. So the LD 1679 is laid out in law, and the state is required to meet those goals. So in the future, it would take an act of the legislature to reverse that legislation. That being said, future administrations might defund the support of the Climate Council, my office. So, excuse me. So certainly it's important to that the future administrations sort of maintain the support to organize and continue working with the Maine Climate Council members. Unfunded mandates often do have challenges. And I think the second question about the Pine Tree Amendment, to be honest, I am not sure how that would affect the future implementation of the Climate Council, and how that would interact with the existing state statutes. I believe that from what I've heard from the public, the first public session, that it's sort of in addition to some of the state requirements and statutes already in law. So I'll be curious to see how that proceeds.
Yes, we all will. It's exciting, the thought of it. The next question is about carbon sequestration. Somebody is wondering if, due to how much forest cover, Maine's 80% forested, I guess, or more, is it possible that we're carbon neutral now? And if that's true, how might that affect our resolve to continue to cut emissions even further?
That's a great question. So we worked with the University of Maine in this process to come up with a first draft estimate of how much carbon we're sequestering in our land and water environments. And so they've estimated that, particularly between our forests and our wood products industry, that we're sequestering the equivalent of about 75% of our annual emissions now. I place some emphasis on saying gross emissions versus contrasting with net emissions, in that LD 1679 actually requires that we reduce our gross emissions, or basically anything we're putting into the atmosphere, regardless of what we are bearing or sequestering. So even if we were carbon neutral today, we are still required to reduce our emissions 45% by 2030 and at least 80% by 2050, which is really important because what the atmosphere ends up seeing is really ultimately what matters.
Good news there. So we have another two-part question. The first part is, Why isn't there more emphasis on conservation, on using less? And the other one is a bit of a technical question, and maybe it's something you're aware of or not, but we seem like we have a bit of a bottleneck in our solar industry, in that solar installers are required to have a master electrician on site at all times, even if they're just running conduit or bolting down panels or whatever. And it seems like a costly and unnecessary bottleneck. So 2 questions there: more emphasis on conservation, and what about this bottleneck?
Yeah, so with the first question, actually conservation and efficiency is a really big part of the building strategy in particular. That is an important additional component, because I think in particular our electricity demands on our grid are going to be going up as we electrify our heating and cooling and transportation. And so ensuring that we have more efficient appliances with energy usage and water efficiency are important. And actually there's a bill being considered right now by the legislature that seeks to establish those standards for appliances for the first time, I believe, in Maine law. So there is something, and that is a great question. There is so much detail that I have a hard time covering all of it, but definitely that I think that we share that concern. And on the master electrician, so yeah, I believe that, well, part of the goal of increasing clean energy jobs is to try to spur more training of people like master electricians who can work in the renewable energy industry and are really essential, but are an area that, to my understanding, Maine doesn't have enough of them. So we are trying to work to ensure that we can grow our economy, and we're working with partners on trying to make sure that there are training opportunities. And I think over the next couple of years, we'll see hopefully more training efforts, because I think the demand is certainly there.
All right, thank you.
If I could, I don't know if this question came up. There was a question about if there's any legislation coming up restricting the global warming potential of refrigerants. And that came to me directly. So I wanted to address that really quick because it's a quick answer. Yes, there is a bill being considered by the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. It's a bill to reduce hydrofluorocarbons in refrigerants, also a number of other end uses, vending machines, foams. There's a whole list. And so there was just a public hearing on that and a work session coming up. So that's coming up really soon.
Good news. Well, we've got quite a few questions, but we're thinking maybe we'll move on to David, and then we'll field some more questions after David's done. And if you want to hang around, you guys can kind of popcorn questions and see. David, I guess Renee's going to take over and give you an introduction, and then we'll move on to that and take some more questions later. Thanks for the great questions, everyone.
All right, so next we have David Costello joining us as the Climate and Clean Energy Director at the Natural Resources Council of Maine. David brings more than 25 years of senior level government management and policy experience to his climate and clean energy work with NRCM. Most recently, he directed 2 non-governmental climate change projects in Maryland and served as the Deputy Secretary in the Maryland Department of the Environment. Prior to his work at the Department of the Environment, he served concurrently as Director of the Governor's Delivery Unit and Director of Maryland's Office of Smart Growth. He attended the University of Maine and is a graduate of George Washington University and the London School of Economics. Thanks for joining us, David.
Thanks, Renee. Let me start by just commending all of the good work that Cassie and her colleagues, that Governor Mills obviously set about doing, and much of the work that was accomplished with legislation in 2019. I really got to see firsthand a lot of the work that over 230 Mainers who participated in developing this plan. It's an amazing plan. I oversaw the development of climate action plans in Maryland between 2008 and 2015, and I can attest that we never had the level of engagement, direct engagement by so many substantive minded people as this plan has come together. So again, I want to commend Cassie and her colleagues. It's a great plan. It's an ambitious plan, and just to mention a couple of things, and I'll get into where I think we are with the actions to implement the plan. The goals that Cassie outlined, as she said, beneficial electrification is so important, because if you look at the targets in the plan, those that help to reach what Maine is required to reach in terms of greenhouse gas reductions, focus on electric vehicle deployment, as well as electrifying the heating of buildings. And I think, well, Cassie certainly mentioned this, 54% of Maine's greenhouse gas challenge is transportation. We're a rural state. Obviously, we want to really do a lot to encourage the deployment, the purchase of electric vehicles throughout rural Maine. Rural Maine households will benefit tremendously. Actually, the studies have shown that rural areas where people drive the most, their benefits would double. The cost of maintaining and operating their vehicles will be cut in half with the deployment of electric vehicles. Challenge now is obviously the price point for these vehicles is higher than combustion engine vehicles. The challenge for Maine, and that's why looking at our goals, we've got about 900 battery electric and maybe another 2,000 plug-in hybrid. So to get to that 41,000 target by 2025 and over 200,000 by 2030 is a significant challenge. With regard to electrifying buildings, we're a bit further ahead. As Cassie said, it looks as though we'll be able to achieve our 2025 target, but our 2030 target is a significant target. And what I'm saying by mentioning this is we've got to do an awful lot, particularly as it relates to resource, finding more resources to help incentivize, provide rebates and other incentives for the purchase of these vehicles and heating systems. So it's a real challenge. And that's one thing I'll mention a little bit as well later. Now, one thing we will never be able to do, quite frankly, as it relates to this plan, we won't be able to achieve the plan without the federal government. So it's awfully good that there's been an administration change, an administration that is taking all of what Cassie said about the impacts that are with us already today, about the impacts on the climate and our environment, as well as our health. And so it's wonderful that we've got a partner in Washington now, because no state, no matter what they're doing, even states like California and Massachusetts that are out front, can never achieve what needs to be achieved without the federal government. And of course, it's great that we've rejoined the Paris Agreement, but of course, if you look at the IPC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, what they've said as they've come up with their findings and their reports is every time they put out a new report, they tell us how much further behind we are and how much more we have to do. And science really demands that we do a tremendous amount between now and 2030. So it will be important for Maine and other states, and certainly the developed jurisdictions around the globe, to do an awful lot between now and 2030. Looking at some of the actions that we are undertaking, as Cassie said, if you look at what's going on with the legislature, it's off to an awfully slow start. And that's understandable given the impact of COVID and how the legislature operates. But as Cassie said, HFC, it looks as though the HFC bill is going to move fairly readily. As Cassie had mentioned, it's a what we would call a potent but short-lived greenhouse gas, whereas carbon will be up in the atmosphere for over 400 years. Some HFCs only last in the atmosphere 15 to 30 years. So again, if we can attack that, which we are legislatively, so that's going to be a win. It's only about 1% of our greenhouse gases now, but if we didn't phase it out globally, it could conceivably be up to 20% or more and certainly a very serious concern. Cassie also mentioned the appliance standards. That bill's likely to move along. It's got administration support. It certainly has considerable support in the advocacy community. One thing I would mention as well that's moving along is what's known as CPACE, Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy Program. And what that means is it allows commercial building owners to upgrade or retrofit their buildings, weatherize their buildings, put in more efficient equipment by taking out loans that are paid through their property payments, their property tax payments, so their monthly payments, and they would stay with the building. So for instance, if someone were thinking they were going to sell the building soon, they wouldn't want to undertake the upgrades, but if they know it's going to stay with the building, that the cost will be borne by those whoever owns the building later on, then that's a very important way to help finance. And that gets at what I said is Maine's biggest challenge, and quite frankly, it's everybody's biggest challenge. How do we fund all of the solutions we need? On the transportation side, I think what Maine will do, it hasn't done yet, unfortunately, is there's an initiative called the Transportation Climate Initiative. My sense is that Maine will sign on. I understand the governor is likely to want to be involved in that at some point. That's critically important, because unless the federal government or we find other sources to fund all of the cleaner transportation solutions, it's going to be awfully hard for us to obviously reach our transportation related targets. On the land conservation side, the governor's already issued an executive order, a carbon task force. So this will get at some of the stuff that Cassie was talking about in terms of with, our working lands. If you look at where the carbon sequestration opportunities are, the oceans are saturated. The air, as Cassie pointed out, is saturated. The soils are really the best place to try to, to sequester carbon, as an example. Now, I think also we'll develop technologies at some point to draw down carbon, which we'll need to do to really meet what we need to do by 2050. And my hope is Maine will be a carbon negative, not a carbon neutral state. And quite frankly, I think we'll benefit financially from being a carbon negative state. But so sequestration, as Cassie said, other opportunities in regards to sequestration, and I know this will be taken up by the task force and hopefully soon by legislation, would be how we develop a system that finances better sequestration practices, as well as embodied carbon, as I think many of you know, that if carbon in wood products last for hundreds of years before they're ever emitted into the atmosphere. And Maine could get credit for that. I mean, if 94% of residential structures are wood, but if you look at commercial buildings, large buildings, it's predominantly cement, glass, aluminum, steel. And of course, those are all carbon emitting. So the extent that we can transform our building sector to embody more carbon in wood, then obviously a state like Maine, and of course we've got to be careful because we want to make sure that it's sustainable, that our forests both grow in terms of the amount of carbon they're stocking, as well as we're able to grow enough trees, quite frankly, to meet a growing demand for wood products. And as Cassie said, not only for wood for mass timber but also for insulation. I mean, if you look at the foam insulation that's being used today, it has an HFC problem, which I think will be addressed hopefully with these HFC phase outs. But obviously Maine would benefit from wood fiber insulation and others. And of course it's much more biodegradable. We need to tackle our waste stream problem as well. And someone mentioned conservation. Not only do we need land conservation, we need conservation, of course, across the board. And there is legislation pending regarding extended producer responsibility, trying to make producers more responsible for the product and the waste they produce, so that we can start to limit the waste streams. And of course, much of the waste that's produced, a lot of it's plastic, and that's obviously something that's that the fossil fuel industry has been making a lot of money producing, and they're doing it with considerable vim and vigor. Looking at some of the other things that are underway, the administration, the governor will soon likely announce an executive order that's calling for developing an EV roadmap. So as I get back to electric vehicles, of course, we need to do a lot there, as I said, in terms of developing or providing enough incentives as the price points come down to get these vehicles on the road and owned in Maine, but also building out infrastructure throughout the state that would ensure, that people obviously have the right places to plug in their vehicle to continue on with their business. The one thing I would mention as well that the administration is doing is offshore wind. Not only, if you look at Maine's energy challenge, and we need to build out our grid, that's one thing that Cassie hinted at. We expect that our grid, as we build out more, electric vehicle demand and load and building demand and load, we're going to need an electric grid that's probably triple the size of what we have now in Maine. And of course, we want to make sure that it's a grid that's smarter, that's more resilient, and that's going to cost money. Now, much of that can be paid for over time, as we've paid for the build out so far, but there are other ways to try to pay for the grid. And one of the most effective is obviously trying to figure out a way to pay for it the lowest cost, and that's lowest cost of capital, right? And so that's why there's some interesting ideas regarding a finance authority of some kind in Maine that might pay for the build out of Maine's electrical grid, as well as the build out of more solar, wind, and storage, and getting to offshore wind. Offshore wind is a big opportunity for Maine, given the resources of the wind off the coast. It's trickier because it has to be floating, but the technology is available, and the governor's to be commended for putting an application forward soon for a research array, which will help to guide Maine in its deployment. Offshore wind has taken off in Europe, especially England, as well as Denmark, Norway, Germany, Netherlands. A number of countries are doing a tremendous job. In the United States, we'll catch up. And of course, that'll be wind power. The solar industry in Maine, is, you've probably heard in the news recently, has taken off as well, thanks to the governor and the legislature. It's taken off so much that we're having trouble now with connection issues. And that's unfortunately part of what a failure of the last administration, but also a failure of the state's utilities, and not really preparing or being ready, or quite frankly, being interested in building out this new renewable clean energy infrastructure, and quite frankly, being ahead of the transition. But that's all taking place. It'll all be a tremendous benefit to the state. There is legislation that's pending to make sure that it's done properly, to build on the legislation that was passed in 2019. And we've also been pushing back on legislation that would want to roll back some of the advances that was made in 2019. I think those bills are dead on arrival. For the most part, people are pushing back. I think we'll be okay there. Cassie mentioned another thing, bonding. And when I talk about lower capital or capital costs, now's the best time to take out loans and bonds, quite frankly. And it's going to be tough. The good news, the federal government stepping up, providing more resources. Thank you, Joe Biden and the Congress. We need more. Keep it up. But the bonding is important as well. And I know the governor's going to put some ideas. There are already ideas out there for a weatherization bond that we're excited about. These general obligation bonds require 2/3, so we need Republican support. Senator Pouillot supporting a weatherization bond that has support from the advocacy community. It'd be $10 million for low and moderate income households, $10 million other dollars for schools and municipalities to weatherize their buildings. We think this is extremely important. Obviously, we'd like to see more, but we'll take what we can get as this relates. But just to give you an idea, this bond alone would provide, help to weatherize an additional 1,500 homes, support about 200 more jobs. And as you efficiency jobs have been the most green jobs of the last decade. And energy efficiency is still the most cost-effective way to deal with climate change. So it's a wonderful win-win if we can do a lot more weatherization and the other energy efficiency kinds of things, the appliance standards that Cassie mentioned. I think that bill will move forward and be supported this session. Other things Cassie mentioned, broadband. Now, we're likely to use some of the federal money for broadband, but there may also be broadband bonding. I'm not sure. But of course, access to bonding, and as Cassie had mentioned, telework, remote work has really brought vehicle miles traveled down. So emissions on the transportation sector have benefited from obviously the utilization of broadband and the internet. I guess one thing I would say about, and we can get to some questions so I don't go on. In terms of citizen action, Cassie mentioned, and I think this is awfully important. This is one thing we try to do in Maryland, is about accountability, coming up with the metrics to measure progress, because as you know, what's measured gets done, right? So we think it's extremely important. We're happy to see that the governor's office is going to put some progress indicators to measure Maine's progress going forward. We want to know how many vehicles are being deployed. We want to know how many vehicle miles traveled are being reduced. We want to know what the inventory is on emissions, right? We want to know what these key actions and bills will deliver. And we want to know where we are as it relates to the plan going forward, because when the council, as it meets, it should be asking these hard questions to ensure that we're making the level of progress we need to, or at least talking about why we're not making that progress and to make adjustments. So I certainly am happy to see that the governor's office is going to put some good progress indicators and some metrics together, and we routinely measure and report on where the state is as it really tries to tackle this incredible challenge going forward. The other things that I guess I would mention, and I think you probably all know this, get engaged with the legislature. It is a tough session. Things are going slow. I'm not optimistic that we're going to get a lot done. Certainly not as much as we need to get going to really juice the plan, to get the plan off to a tremendous start. The state does have some resources it's dedicating. As Cassie said, there is money for electric vehicles, but many of the other things, another important bond I hope people would rally around, and I know the governor supports this, is the Lands for Maine's Future bond. There's legislation pending. We want a lot more money going to land conservation and helping to support working lands. There's also a bill for healthy soils that would help the agricultural community put in place better practices that would help with regenerative ag, as well as sequestering a lot more carbon and, quite frankly, growing a lot more product in Maine so that we don't have to bring in all of that carbon intensive food from Chile and California. So as you're paying attention to the legislature, do the internet and these Zooms, even though I'm starting to hate Zooms, I do too many Zoom meetings or team meetings or whatever. I don't want to, it allows citizens to really participate more in public hearings and work sessions. So do encourage your folks to do that, particularly for any initiative or piece of legislation you support. And I think that's the best way now. I mean, obviously, it's important for legislators to hear from constituents, right? So if you've got friends in districts that are a challenge, reach out to them, have them contact their legislator in the coming session. And I think that's the most effective way. Obviously, direct contact is tougher with COVID, but certainly via Zoom or email or phone calls, whatever they think they can, reach out. And Renee and Scott, why don't I just stop there and leave much of the rest of the time for questions for Cassie and I.
Well, thank you so much. That was great. A good overview of kind of what we're up against here. So lots of questions were coming in, and I think there's a lot of interest about our grid. You both mentioned, potential for, as we, beneficial electrification will require up to 3 times as much electricity as we're using right now. So there were a few questions. And a lot of them have to do with changing the way somebody asked about, has there been thought to leaving ISO New England and becoming energy independent? Somebody else mentioned a consumer-owned utility. You talked about the smart grid of the future and cheaper funding for the utility. So there was some talk about that. And then there was another question, and I'm just going to pile all these on here, about hydropower and why do we consider that necessarily clean energy, given the environmental impacts of that and these big transmission lines. So
Is that to me, Scott?
well, you could start with your thoughts on the consumer-owned utility. Maybe both of you. I'd love to know what the governor's office is thinking about that as well. It seems to be a kind of a groundswell movement right now. I
conceptually, I definitely support. I mean, if you look at the cost going forward, they estimate it's going to cost over $40 billion to build out the grid that we need. Now, we pay a lot of money a year already in grid improvements, but the most cost-effective way would be, quite frankly, to support. And now the politics are treacherous. To support a consumer-owned utility, or at least an authority, a public authority that was able to quite frankly get, to do bonding at 3%, as opposed to what the utilities can get to build out infrastructure at 8 to 10%. So that's, from a simple economics conceptual idea, a consumer-owned utility it makes the most sense from a financial standpoint. But I just think the politics are awfully tough. It's certainly something I support. I wouldn't, let me just leave it at that. And as far as the grid, the ISO question, Maine wouldn't need to leave ISO New England. For instance, if we had a consumer-owned utility, or we still had these investor-owned utilities with a generation authority, say for instance, this public authority started to build out the grid and build out generation assets like renewable clean energy assets, you could still work within the New England ISO. We have consumer-owned utilities or public utilities in Maine as it is. And so there's no reason to leave the market, the wholesale market, because quite frankly, Maine can benefit, right? We are the state in New England that can generate the most clean energy and make money doing it, right? And we can sell that to Canada if we've got the right transmission system. So I don't think we need to leave New England ISO. I would like us, I'm not sure the politics are there, I would like us to get to a place where we're building out the grid much more cost effectively, with more public interest in mind, less money going to shareholders, quite frankly. But I'll just stop. I'll stop there and let Cassie weigh in.
Thanks, David. I think you did a good job getting at the complexity of this, and our energy working group, buildings and transportation working groups all wrestled a lot with this question of how much additional energy will be required with electrification, how to make those changes to the grid. In the end, the recommendation that was included in Maine Won't Wait was that, and I'm looking at my copy of Maine Won't Wait right here to make sure I get the wording right, but they recognize that a comprehensive stakeholder process should be convened this year to really examine that transformation of our electric sector and facilitate some of these other recommendations from Maine Won't Wait. They recognize that more study and time and stakeholder engagement is needed to identify the most cost-effective, greenhouse gas effective, and practical paths forward. And I think it's managing both the generation and the demand sides. I know were big pieces of conversation that I think will continue in that process moving forward. So the governor's energy office, I believe, was who was tapped to help convene that stakeholder process later this year. So definitely a lot. It's very complex, and I think more study is needed. And we'll hopefully have that process beginning soon to get greater clarity on how that will work for Maine.
Great. A couple more questions on energy. Well, there's the one about how hydropower from Quebec is viewed in terms of clean energy and its climate impacts and environmental impacts. Any thoughts on how that fits into our energy goals?
To be honest, my office is, because we're not a regulatory agency, we haven't engaged with the clean energy corridor or examined the data. So I don't think I can honestly give an answer that is data informed on that, unfortunately. I think I can just speak to my general understanding of hydropower. Once it has been built, it doesn't generate emissions directly. I think that's why it is referred to as clean power. That doesn't mean that there aren't environmental impacts from it, but I think generally clean is applied when something doesn't necessarily generate emissions directly through that electricity generation.
David, does NRCM have any thoughts on that?
Really vocal, I think, as probably many of your colleagues know. We have a real problem with it. Obviously, we think it's a bad deal for Maine. But I'll stay away from the politics a bit and just say that the problem is well, the environmental impacts are going to be significant, and we don't think we should be tearing down forest, some of the most important temporal forest, and quite frankly precious temporal forest and left on the planet to basically transmit electricity from Quebec to Massachusetts. The best route for that would have been through Vermont. Vermont had come up with a plan. It would have been a lot more expensive through Vermont. And that's why they chose to come to Maine. The two other things. So one, it's a shame that this transmission line, we wouldn't be opposed to transmission lines. Obviously, we'd love to see transmission in the right place. We'd love to see better transmission up to northern Maine, for instance, where we've got considerable, clean energy assets or conceivable assets, right, that need to be connected to Canada and New England. We just think this corridor coming through Western Maine is not a good deal for Maine. Also, not only because the damage to the forest and the vernal pools and all of that in Western Maine, but also it doesn't deliver a greenhouse gas benefit, because the power that Massachusetts will purchase will require someone else to purchase gas or other carbon emitting electricity somewhere else. It's not as though there's a genuine surplus that of these electrons that are produced, because Cassie's right. I mean, obviously hydro is much cleaner than these other sources once it's been established, once you've addressed how you built the dams and what the degradation of the forest land or whatever's been taken over by the water behind the dam, and the emissions as it relates to methane, all of that. Cassie's right about hydro producing cleaner electrons. But again, we just think the other one, there's no greenhouse gas benefit to this particular project. The other thing is that whenever you invest in these kinds of projects, you're taking money away from needed cleaner energy projects like wind and solar. That's the way people used to argue that gas was the transition, natural gas, to a clean energy future. Well, if you invest in natural gas, you're not investing more into, a cleaner electricity sources like wind and solar and geothermal and tidal and storage. So we think it's displacing a lot of important money that should be invested in other cleaner energy projects in Maine. And so for a number of reasons, we've opposed obviously the corridor. And I guess I'll just stop there. Scott, one thing I would just say about financing, I should have said earlier, one bill that may have legs this session as well is called the Clean Energy Accelerator, which
Mm.
is a form of green lending. We're supportive of that. We think that's going to have a fair amount of support this session. Basically, it's like you've probably heard of terms of a green bank, which would allow, in this instance, the Efficiency Maine Trust, because it would have to be seeded by federal money, to establish a lending instrument that would help to fund some of the things we'd like to do as it relates to cleaner energy projects, energy efficiency projects. So I just wanted to add that.
I'm so glad you brought that up because it didn't exactly come up in the Q&A, but I feel like that's a really exciting prospect on the horizon here to finance some of this build out. We could probably talk about the grid and how we're going to build that out for the rest of the time, but there's a couple other questions here. One is about transportation, and somebody asked if all state agencies are on board with the state's climate goals. And one of the things CB's been trying to do is establish a bike lane that's kind of connects a pretty safe highway route with the downtown. But it goes along our lake and lots of people park there, and it forces bikes out into the traffic lane where there's a lot of traffic. And we just didn't feel like we got a lot of positive feedback from the state on helping us to create a safe connector there for bikes to get, especially kids, to get from town out to the lake and stuff. And I'm just wondering if the state agencies are really mandated, and I would tag on to that the public transportation issue too. I know Maine spends about 1/12 of, say, what Vermont spends on public transport. Do you see that changing as well?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer those questions. So to take them in reverse order, one of the recommendations in Maine Won't Wait is to increase the amount of spending on public transportation. The Transportation Working Group recognized that spending is very low in Maine compared with other states, and they recommended boosting that. I can't recall the exact number off the top of my head, but I remember that being recommended by the working group.
The $5, yeah.
I think
$5. Yeah.
That was what I thought, but I didn't want to misspeak.
Well,
Yes, so all of Maine state agencies have been asked to review the climate action plan and to report back to the administration on how they and their commissioners, how they can propose to implement different parts of the climate action plan. That's a process that they're in the middle of right now. I know DOT is particularly active in that. And so I think in the next year, the agencies will be coming out with changes in rulemaking, and also as we get the electric vehicle roadmap off the ground, hopefully soon, coming up with more concrete strategies for implementing the plan. Unfortunately, I can't really speak to your specific project and how that's that interaction with DOT has gone. But I know that the state agencies and commissioners are very committed to helping to implement the climate action plan,
great.
given existing resources and budget constraints. I mean, we're certainly hoping that the budgetary picture improves as we climb out of the pandemic recession, and federal resources come as well. That might help move things around. So I think that the picture right now is pretty conservative, but we are hoping that that picture improves because there will be a lot more investment needed to fully implement this plan.
Great. One of the things that's comes up a lot in these discussions, and there's a couple mentions of it in the questions here, is this notion of a fee on carbon. And CB has a CCL, a carbon Citizens Climate Lobby chapter, and has been a number of people have been lobbying pretty hard for that at a federal level. Do you know if the state has any plans, or any part of this climate action plan has addressed the notion of a fee and dividend, where fees would be collected, but the fees would be just given back to taxpayers or citizens to cover the costs that it would of the cost of things being escalated from gasoline to heating oil, et cetera?
Well, it was certainly a concept that was recommended by a lot of CCL folks throughout the process.
No
So I am
doubt.
definitely familiar with it. And Maine Won't Wait ended up recommending that the state of Maine not act alone, because it can be somewhat limiting for a single state program, to my understanding. But the plan recommended that we engage in multi-state carbon program discussions that can both support our natural and working lands and state carbon neutrality goals. So that's a process that the Governor's Energy Office and our state agencies, after their review, will be beginning in the next couple of years. And we hope that by working on a more regional basis, that any sort of carbon program can have a more powerful impact and powerful benefits for Maine.
Nice. Yeah, somebody else actually asked a question about working with other New England states or the Northeast, mentioning that on a couple levels, Maine has all these forests in terms of sequestering carbon, and also in terms of a regional food system, Maine's being really looked at. The New England Food Vision is really looking hard at Maine to produce a lot more food regionally, which David mentioned. Our food system is, we're responsible for all of that, not only the carbon footprint of our food, but all the environmental degradation that goes with it. And if you look at the American Midwest or, parts of the global South. So wondering, and there's also, just to pile on here, the Transportation Climate Initiative, that's more of a Northeast. So just maybe either of you or both of you could talk a little bit about any initiatives, the TCI or other initiatives that are regional that would be helpful. Do you want to start on that, David, and maybe pass it along?
Well, a couple of things, and I would throw in, before I get into that, Scott, I would just mention there are a number of bills nationally that relate to carbon pricing, and I'm sure you're familiar, and I know Cassie's familiar, and we may succeed, but Cassie's right. We really need, as economists, I think most climate scientists and certainly economists would agree that the most effective way to get out what we need to do as it relates to our carbon problem is to put a price on carbon. And now how you structure that, obviously you want to make sure it's not regressive. But anyway, that's something that I think we'll have to deal with. We won't deal with our problem without it, quite frankly, at some point. But getting to the regional issues, we are using regional solutions now because we don't have a national plan. We don't have a national price on carbon. So the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative has been quite successful. That's a regional program. It was a cap and invest program. It was short of putting a direct price on carbon, but it's been somewhat effective. We've, our electric power facilities, much of it's because of the shift to gas, quite frankly, which was cheaper than coal as they started fracking it. But it's an example of a regional program that's helped to drive benefits. And Maine's a part of RGGI. Billions of dollars have been taken from RGGI and put into energy efficiency programs, other clean energy programs. TCI is an example. It was meant to be a program that sort of copied what RGGI has done. It's a Transportation Climate Initiative. Only a number of states are involved. Maine's kind of notionally been involved. I don't want to pick on Cassie because I know Maine's going to become more involved. But we're not quite there yet. But what it's meant to do, again, and it depends how you structure it, it would generate a lot more revenue. As you probably know, Maine's not the only state, but most states it's been hard for them to raise transportation money. For instance, raising a gas tax has been a political non-starter. So TCI was a way to raise some money, and it could have raised up to $150 million a year, for instance, for Maine. To put into cleaner energy, cleaner transportation solutions like walking and biking paths, smarter growth in villages and communities throughout the state, as well as public transportation. If you want to get to that per capita investment, this is a way to get there, as well as money for electrification. So I think we'll eventually get there, and we need to get there. But Cassie's right. The best solutions, if we can do it nationally, because I'll throw in one more thing that we could do regionally, and you mentioned it, it's about sequestration and healthy soils. But you can imagine if there were a national market for a sequestration market for both embodied carbon as well as, and this would be a temporary market that would only be in place until the emissions were eliminated, the mitigation actions which are more expensive than sequestration. So you could develop a national market, sequestration market, that a state like Maine could benefit tremendously from, and the country would benefit, and you'd sequester carbon much more cheaply or less expensively than actually eliminating the emissions, which will cost more money and time. But this could play out over the next 30 years, and that's another sort of regional approach or national approach that could be utilized.
Dr. Rose, do you have any thoughts about the regional?
Yeah, so I think what I just mentioned about multi-state carbon program discussions, that's absolutely going to be talking about national working lands. I know that the Agriculture, Conservation, Forestry Commissioner, and who co-chaired our National Working Lands Working Group, is particularly focused on supporting our food systems in Maine and increasing the amount of local food grown and eaten here. And that helps, I would imagine, help us with our regional food production to our neighboring states as well. And I do know that we have been monitoring TCI and observing the discussions for some time. I'm not quite sure what the current status of that is. We didn't sign on to the MOU, but we are, I believe, monitoring how those are going moving forward.
Great. Well, we're getting ready to wrap up here. I just thought I'd mention a few things. There's a lot of stuff about food in the chat. Electrification of farm machinery, for instance, lower the carbon footprint of our food, besides, fostering sequestration in soils. There's some question about one of the things, CB is kind of a permaculture organization in terms of stacking functions, like why use herbicides on our power lines? Why not graze animals on our power lines? Wondering if there's, talk about more integration of electrification and just energy of how our food system is going to play into our plan here. And then we'll leave it at that and wrap it up. Either of you want to have any ideas? Yeah.
Happy to tackle that one. Yes. I think our strategy, protecting natural environments and natural and working lands and waters, particularly wants to provide technical support and assistance where possible. And I think incentives for helping our food producers and other natural sort of heritage industries reduce their emissions impacts, transition to either more efficient or electrified equipment, heating, cooling, that it can be a very big consideration for food producers as well, cooling and shipping. And so that is absolutely part of the efforts to try to provide more resources to help them move towards reducing their emissions impact, as well as just the resiliency side of adjusting and adapting to the impacts of climate change.
Great. Gonna tackle
Scott,
this
I
on
was
all fronts.
just going quickly about agrovoltaics, right? There's no reason, and this is being explored already in Maine, that you can graze under, obviously graze under solar panels. You can have pollinating plants. You can have, if the panels are high enough, you can grow certain crops.
Right.
So I think that you'll see more of that. Solar siting is an issue. I know the governor's offices, as we are, I think most people are concerned about the proper siting of energy efficiency facilities. I mean, energy generation facilities like solar. So I think we'll do a better job of that as we continue to go forward. But there are a lot of opportunities for Maine, as Cassie said, with our working lands to be extremely productive, both from an energy perspective as well as food and forest products and sequestration.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. This has been super informative and I must say somewhat hopeful. I think a lot of us are starting to feel a little more hopeful these days with everything that's going on, and keep up the great work. And again, appreciate it. So I just want to thank everyone else for coming tonight, and all your thoughtful questions. Sorry we couldn't get to everything, but I think it was a good conversation. Just want to point out a couple things that coming up for CB. We're sort of shifting from our indoor virtual winter programming to we're going to start getting outside and planting some gardens and thinking about growing food and working with our working group. So we've got some things coming up. We're going to be kind of rethinking our edible Main Street project, and that's coming up. Hopefully everybody's on our newsletter. If you're not, please do subscribe. On April 3rd from 1 to 4 at CB on the parking lot, on the sidewalk in front of CB, we're going to have a seed swap. Socially distance, wear your mask, bring some seeds if you want to trade. We're going to have some seeds for people and kind of get in the gardening spirit there. We're going to start repairing and getting all of our bike share bikes out on April 7th at 1:30. We're going to drag them up and start getting those ready to go. We'll probably start putting some bikes out later in April. We have a chapter of our education working group hosts a chapter of Inside Outside outdoor education workshop on April 15th. We're going to be rolling out Solidarity Gardens very soon. Last year we built about 14 gardens throughout the community in various places, and we're going to be doing that again this year. So please join that. Keep an eye out for the We Built This workshops, women-led carpentry workshops. And be sure to follow CB on social media to keep up with all this great stuff. And happy spring to everybody. And on we go. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Take
Night,
care.
y'all. Thanks again.